with William, the future king.
The real reason Meghan hunted her way into the royal family. The deeply disturbing way Meghan flirted with William, making him recoil in disgust. And the real truth about why Meghan actually fled the royal family. A truth so foul it demolishes everything the public was told. Everything you believed was a lie. And Sophie just ripped the whole story wide open. The woman who wanted the wrong crown. On April 1st, 2026, an interview clip began spreading online like a firestorm. Then just as fast it started being deleted, but not before thousands had already witnessed it. In the clip, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, was publicly accusing Meghan Markle of improper conduct. People were praying it was a joke. It simply had to be a prank. After all, it was April Fool's Day. Surely this was just a cruel joke being played on the entire nation. But then noon rolled around and more people were swearing on everything they loved, that they had seen the shocking video with their own eyes, and that every second of it was horrifyingly real. Soon rumours were flying across social media that a senior palace official had actually released a public statement. It stated that Sophie's words reflected the long-held expectations for conduct inside the royal family and the standards required to protect the monarchy. The palace was standing firmly behind every single word she said. Sophie was not fighting this battle on her own. She had the full backing of the entire royal family. The family picked her for a reason. She was the one person no one could dismiss as just being bitter or threatened. What Sophie said next completely destroyed the Sussex narrative millions believed. Meghan Sophie alleged never even wanted the Sussex title in the first place. Sussex was just a consolation prize. What Meghan was truly aiming for from the start was the title of Princess of Wales and the man who came with it. Sophie told the interviewer that she told her husband Edward early on that something felt deeply wrong about Meghan. Meghan wasn't trying to fit in with the family. She was positioning herself for a specific prize within it. She wasn't focused on the role she was given. She was staring at the throne right next to her. The warning signs were screaming long before the public had any idea. In 2017, Meghan was still just Harry's girlfriend. No engagement had yet been announced. The palace had not approved a single public statement about the relationship. Yet Meghan waltzed into a full interview with Vanity Fair, one of the most powerful magazines on earth, and confirmed the entire romance on her own terms without telling Harry's team or the palace. Staff inside the firm were livid. They privately called it her first power play, a clear message that she intended to play by her own rules before even agreeing to follow them. Then came the tiara scandal in the weeks before the May 2018 wedding. And the story you think you know is not even close to the truth. Meghan demanded a particular tiara from the Queen's collection. The Queen's dresser, Angela Kelly, denied the request. Harry then reportedly exploded at the staff over this. What almost nobody reported was the real reason for the refusal. The tiara Meghan had chosen had a serious history. It was one of several royal pieces that originally belonged to the Russian imperial family before the 1917 revolution. When that empire collapsed, the jewels scattered across Europe. Some pieces were acquired cleanly, others were smuggled out by people fleeing Russia with things that weren't theirs to take. Because of that sketchy history, the palace had very strict rules for those particular jewels. Whoever wore them needed a spotless security file, no grey areas and absolutely no unanswered questions. The problem was Meghan's security clearance hadn't actually been fully approved yet. Her background check raised red flags about certain relationships and contacts she had made during her years working in Hollywood. Until those connections were fully vetted and cleared, that specific tiara was completely off the table. So while Harry screamed at staff about some jewellery, the real reason it was being denied was sitting in a pending security file with his future wife's name on it. He either didn't know the truth or he just didn't care. The household staff never forgot that. For many of them, it was the moment they knew exactly what was about to happen. But what took place before the wedding was just the start. What happened after Meghan was inside the family was far more calculated and sinister than anything that came before. What the cameras almost missed. As Sophie reached this point in the interview, something in her entire demeanour changed. The warmth she had in her voice during the first part of the interview iced over into something much harder and more dangerous. She leaned forward slightly, saying that Meghan's strange behaviour toward William was not a one-time thing. This wasn't a cultural misunderstanding between an American and the formal British establishment. It was a clear pattern, she said, and it all began in May of 2018, just 72 hours after Meghan married Harry and officially joined the royal family with guests all around. Meghan greeted William with a lingering kiss on his cheek, then held his forearm in a firm, prolonged grip that no one in the room could dismiss as just normal. William's entire body went rigid. Senior staff standing nearby shot each other looks. The single word that went around internally later was alarm. A duchess part of the family for less than 3 days had already shattered the most basic physical boundaries around the man who was destined to become king. 5 months later, at a mental health event at Buckingham Palace in October 2018, Meghan placed her hand flat against William's back as she spoke to him. This wasn't just a brush or an accident. It was a deliberate flat palm touch on his back, the kind of gesture you'd use with a spouse or parent, not your brother-in-law, at a formal royal function. William yanked his body away instantly. It was a silent, obvious rejection of a boundary that never should have been tested. Sophie noted it then, remembering how William's body flinched as if he'd been burned. January of 2019 brought the Royal Foundation Forum, a public event where all 4 of them appeared together to talk about charity. The public saw unity, but Sophie saw something else entirely. Meghan had completely rejected the pre-arranged seating plan for the panel, the usual royal setup that places couples together, William with Catherine, Harry with Meghan. Instead, she pushed to be seated right next to William. Throughout the event, she kept cutting into Catherine's speaking time, pulling all the media attention directly back to herself. Meghan clearly decided her celebrity status put her on equal footing with the future King and Queen of England, and she acted on it without a second thought. But the press completely missed something that happened even earlier back in July of 2018 at Wimbledon. Meghan attended the tennis tournament, ordered her security to physically block photographers from taking her picture in a public place, and created days of headlines about her demands for privacy. That's the story everybody reported. What no one reported was what went on inside the private box, where Meghan was sitting, a box that put her in very close proximity to William's inner circle. According to people who were there, Meghan spent a huge part of the afternoon aiming her full attention and energy directly at William from across the box, repeatedly trying to pull him into direct eye contact and conversation, all while Catherine was sitting just a short distance away in the very same group. One person who was there called it so conspicuous that it made everyone in the room feel completely uncomfortable, and the people who saw it happen carried that memory with them for years. By March of 2021, the palace launched a formal internal HR review, and the bullying claims against Meghan hit international headlines. But Sophie revealed the report went much deeper than just staff complaints. It actually contained a documented log of boundary violations that spanned years. There were records of late-night messages sent directly to senior royals, totally bypassing every single official communication channel that existed. There were also accounts of Meghan forcing physical contact on the Queen and Prince. Charles during formal events in ways that multiple witnesses called staged and performative instead of genuinely warm. And the most damaging finding in the entire file was this: Meghan had been leaking private family conversations directly to her American media contacts. She was using the intimate details of Windsor family life to craft her public identity as the warm, open American versus the cold, rigid British royals, all while the very people she was describing were sitting in rooms just down the hall from her. Sophie's summary of Meghan's real objective was absolutely devastating. She wasn't just trying to belong, she was trying to become the most powerful person in the room. Meghan wanted to be the star, and if she couldn't be the Queen, she was determined to make the Queen's life unbearable. Then in late 2018, Catherine did something that completely shattered the story the world had been sold about her. She didn't cry quietly in a palace hallway, nor did she confide in a friend over the phone. Catherine picked up a pen and filed a formal documented complaint against Meghan directly through a private channel to a senior household official. This wasn't a staff grievance processed through an HR system, and it wasn't handled by lawyers acting on her behalf. This was personal, with Catherine putting her own name on the record, stating plainly that her sister-in-law's conduct toward her husband had gone too far and could no longer be tolerated without being documented. It never leaked out, and it never reached a single journalist. The palace buried it with the type of silence that only money and power can maintain indefinitely. But that complaint did not just disappear. And this right here is where the story gets absolutely savage. 3 years later, when the 2021 review tore through the household, that complaint was dragged right back out and made the centre of the whole process. Sources with direct knowledge of that review confirmed it was sitting right there, referenced, counted, and fully exposed. There was absolutely nowhere left to hide. Sophie wasn't revealing anything the palace hadn't already documented themselves. Catherine had already put it in writing years before the world ever heard a whisper of it. And William never gave Meghan an inch. His reserve was total holding up, without a single exception, against every single approach she tried to make. Every gesture was met with a step back. Each advance was met with a professional distance that no amount of her persistence was ever going to break through. And when it became crystal clear that William was never going to budge, the strategy didn't just stop. It simply changed direction. What followed was colder, far more calculated, and infinitely more destructive than anything that had come before, because this time the target wasn't William at all. It was the one person in the royal family that Meghan could easily sink her fangs into: how Harry was taken. Sophie's voice dropped when she reached this part of the story, but it wasn't for dramatic effect. She lowered it the way someone does when what they are about to reveal genuinely causes them pain to say out loud. Sophie said Meghan knew absolutely everything. She knew all about the horrific fate that had befallen Harry's mother, Princess Diana. Meghan was well aware of the trauma that had been sitting completely unhealed inside of him for more than 2 decades. She knew how it had forced Harry to live his whole life as the spare son in a family where birth order dictates your entire existence. Meghan knew every single wound Sophie insisted, and yet she never made an attempt to heal even one of them. Instead, Meghan deliberately pressed on every single wound she found, using the pain that it caused to keep Harry exactly where she needed him to be. Hearing that spoken out loud so plainly and directly on a live national broadcast was one of the most chilling moments in the whole 5-hour interview. By 2019, the entire campaign against William had permanently stalled. So Meghan turned her complete focus onto Harry and started dismantling every relationship he had left. Now, this didn't happen in some big dramatic confrontation. It was far more subtle than that. It unfolded slowly, very carefully, over months of small moves that, taken individually, each seemed perfectly innocent. When William's office would reach out to arrange some time between the brothers, the response that came back was always the same. Meghan would reply that they were busy. Meghan felt that they needed more space. Message by message and request by request, Harry's direct line to his own brother was systematically severed. 2 brothers who had once walked side by side behind their mother's coffin as just young teenagers. Brothers who had leaned on each other through everything the royal family put them through eventually stopped speaking to one another directly. Sophie actually called it a psychological blockade, and that description was chillingly accurate. Meghan positioned herself as the only person on the entire planet who truly understood Harry, while making sure he believed everyone else who loved him before her was secretly against him. You see, she needed him to be completely and utterly isolated, so he had nowhere else to turn except directly to her. The christening of their son Archie in July of 2019 publicly revealed just how total that control had really become. Meghan flat out refused the proposed photographers and then refused to even name the godparents, as if all that wasn't enough. She refused to allow the basic constitutional transparency that royal births had required for literal generations. She treated her son's position in the line of succession as a private family affair that the monarchy had no right to document. Sophie read that specific moment without any ambiguity whatsoever. It wasn't about a preference for privacy. It was a bold declaration that the ancient rules of the crown stopped at Meghan's front door and would go no further than she allowed. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Meghan was telling staff members directly that her position as a duchess meant she was equal to Catherine, not in a hierarchy beneath her. She started demanding the exact same security team, the very same budget, and the same massive global platform. When palace officials rejected those demands by pointing to constitutional laws that had governed the family for centuries, Meghan refused to accept their explanation. She collected every single refusal and every denial, stacking them all into a carefully constructed narrative of personal persecution. She claimed being treated differently, all because of her race. She was being deliberately diminished. The victimhood architecture was built piece by painful piece, and it was designed specifically to resonate with a global audience. When Sophie actually reached out to Meghan in 2020 and offered her some personal guidance, it was a truly genuine act of kindness from a woman who had herself navigated that same terrifying transition from civilian life to royal duty. Sophie knew exactly what it felt like. She had lived through it herself. So she offered to share all the hard lessons she had learned. Meghan's response was just 3 words. "I have Harry," she said back, and that was supposedly all that she needed. Sophie didn't hear those 3 words as just some polite brush-off. No, she heard them as a stark declaration of total and complete ownership. Model. Meghan had zero interest in learning how the institution actually worked. Her entire focus was on creating a total monopoly over Harry's loyalty, ensuring no outside voices could ever reach him. Outside the palace's tight-knit inner circle, no one knew how bad it had gotten, and what happened behind closed legal doors was far darker than any public drama. It all started with a lawsuit. Early in 2020, Meghan launched a legal battle against the Mail on Sunday. The paper had published a deeply personal handwritten letter she had sent to her estranged father Thomas Markle. Meghan claimed that publishing the letter was a complete and total violation of her privacy. On the surface, it looked like a clear-cut case of a woman protecting her private correspondence from a newspaper that had clearly crossed a line. But below that clean surface, something truly dangerous was brewing. See, every lawsuit involves a discovery process, the stage where both sides are legally forced to hand over all documents, communications, and records. And in this lawsuit, the discovery process had the power to reveal something absolutely catastrophic for Meghan. It threatened to drag the entire history of her private communications with British journalists and media figures right out into open court. The public story Meghan had been carefully building was one of a defenceless woman, hunted by a cruel and relentless media machine. However, the communications that discovery might reveal told a completely different story. Meghan's own lawyers knew the danger, so they quietly advised her to archive a huge volume of those very private media communications. The palace's legal team saw the exposure risk just as clearly, yet Harry hadn't been told any of this. According to insiders with direct knowledge, he was only given a heavily simplified version of what was really going on. He was told the lawsuit was all about protecting their personal privacy. What no one told Harry was this: it was also about protecting a paper trail that would have demolished the narrative being carefully built for Oprah Winfrey's cameras. Now you have to look at the letter itself, because it was not at all what it appeared to be. Before Meghan actually sent it to her father, palace communications staff had reportedly seen an early draft. At least one senior aide voiced serious concerns, and their worry was both specific and deeply troubling. It looked like certain passages in that letter had been crafted with two very different audiences in mind simultaneously. The language was raw and painful enough to cut her father deeply on a personal level, but it was also measured and cautious enough to sound like a wronged, heartbroken daughter, if it ever leaked. It was, in other words, a letter designed to work as a private weapon, but a public shield. And Thomas gave the letter to the Mail on Sunday. Ultimately, the court did find in Meghan's favour, but the proceedings also confirmed something that simply could not be swept under the rug. At the exact same time, Meghan was writing to her father detailing the unbearable pain of being misrepresented by the press. 5 of her closest friends were busy giving coordinated anonymous quotes to People magazine about that very same subject. This was not spontaneous, it was not a coincidence, this was an organised operation. A private letter filled with raw anguish to a father and a coordinated media play to build public sympathy were happening side by side from the same person at the exact same time. When Sophie finally did speak out publicly, she didn't reference the letter directly. She didn't need to. She just stated that Meghan had taken a private family disagreement and completely rebranded it as some kind of human rights violation. And that letter is exactly where the rebranding first started. The Oprah interview was the moment it went global, and Sophie was brutally direct about what that interview truly was. It was not some frightened woman finally finding the courage to tell her story. It was a calculated commercial launch, and the brand being sold was built entirely on damage inflicted upon the Windsor family. And to make matters worse, there was the timing. Sophie confirmed she personally reached out to Meghan several times before the interview actually aired. She had offered a path to reconciliation. She had opened a door, but every single one of her attempts was flatly rejected. And then the interview went on air. And as the interview aired, Prince Philip was lying in a hospital bed, receiving cardiac care. He was 99 years old. The palace did not see what they were watching as some desperate cry for help from a family member. They experienced it as a calculated attack, specifically timed to hit the institution when it was at its most exposed and emotionally vulnerable. And it was not the first time timing had been used like a weapon. The Sussex's Netflix trailer was released right during Earthshot, one of William's flagship initiatives. Their holiday special was purposely scheduled to drop right up against Catherine's popular Christmas Carol concert. It seemed every major piece of Sussex content was aimed squarely at a specific royal family moment. The pattern never seemed to change. The damage was never accidental. By the time the world watched Harry on that California lawn, something essential had simply vanished from him. The man beside Meghan in that interview had been utterly cut off from his family. He was cut off from every single friend, every relationship he had in his life before Meghan ever came along. He'd been given a script to follow a story he certainly didn't write himself, and he was completely trapped inside of it. But the most disturbing part, he actually believed every single word he was saying. What neither Harry nor Meghan seemed to get was simple. The very institution they spent years trying to tear down had weathered storms far worse than anything they could throw at it. The institution was still standing, they were not. And the true consequences of their actions were only just starting to hit home. It involved the children, the crown, and a threat made just before the summit. Sophie took a deep breath, steeling herself before dropping this next absolute bombshell. She stated the crown never once demanded a DNA test. Then she paused, letting the weight of her words land. Sophie explained that when people wonder why the children's titles weren't immediately confirmed, the answer is one single word: discretion. And inside that family, she said, discretion isn't just about biology. It's about being sure of someone's true intentions. The entire broadcast studio fell silent. All around the globe, that clip went viral on social media before Sophie could even finish her sentence. She never used the word fraud. She didn't directly accuse anyone of lying about the situation because she simply didn't need to. That one word, discretion, placed so carefully in that sentence with that deliberate pause. It was a live grenade, and she had just pulled the pin on live television. To really grasp why those words exploded the way they did, you first have to understand what constitutional transparency really means to the royal family. For hundreds of years, any birth in the royal line of succession required the monarchy to officially document and then publicly confirm the child's lineage for anyone who might one day inherit the throne. This isn't just a simple formality. It's a critical constitutional duty with centuries of legal precedent behind it. When Meghan refused this transparency for both Archie and Liette, she didn't just make a personal choice about her privacy. She actively blocked the monarchy from performing a crucial duty it had carried out without a single exception for many generations. Meghan created a vacuum where solid proof and documentation should have been, and all the suspicion that rushed in to fill that void. It wasn't invented by hostile reporters or a prejudiced public. No, it was created by an actual member of the royal family. You can't turn the system into a weapon and then demand all of its privileges. The titles for both Archie and Lilith were always conditional on maintaining a transparent relationship with the crown. Since Meghan had shattered that relationship, the children's titles didn't automatically follow. What really went down at the Sandringham Summit in January of 2020 has never been reported publicly, and it is the darkest chapter of this whole story. This summit was an emergency crisis meeting. Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles, Prince William and Prince Harry all sat down in one room to hammer out the terms for the Sussexes' exit from their royal duties. The mood was already incredibly devastating for the family. But before the meeting officially started, Harry pulled his own father aside for a private chat. According to sources in royal biographies later backed up by separate accounts from inside the palace, Harry told Charles in that private conversation that if Meghan's complete list of terms were not met, which meant keeping their royal titles operating financially independent from the palace and getting to keep their publicly funded security, then Meghan had instructed him to say she would give an explosive interview to a major American network that would be far more damaging than anything the family had ever faced. So Harry delivered this threat to his own father directly on behalf of his wife, a wife who wasn't even in the building. Reports say Charles went completely silent for a long moment. Then he looked at his son and asked just one question. He asked if Meghan even understood what she was threatening to do. Harry had no answer. The Queen was briefed on this shocking exchange right before the formal negotiations actually began. People who were there that day say that private threat was the exact moment the Queen's view of Meghan changed from deeply complicated to completely and permanently shattered. Publicly, the Sandringham Summit is remembered as just a painful family negotiation, but behind those closed doors, it was the moment the monarchy realised with absolute clarity they weren't just managing a difficult daughter-in-law, they were being held at gunpoint by one. Then came the summer of 2022, and what the Sussex team did over those months left palace staff utterly breathless with rage. Queen Elizabeth was 96 years old. Her health had been visibly declining for months, and she had almost completely stopped making public appearances. The entire country quietly understood with an immense sense of sorrow that the end of a 70-year reign was near prepared to say goodbye to the monarch who had defined the institution for 7 decades. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry's lawyers were busy filing trademark applications in America for a new venture named Royal Globe. The legal paperwork covered a vast media production empire, including podcasts, lifestyle content, and even educational materials across an incredibly wide range of commercial categories. Trademark filings of that magnitude take months of intensive legal preparation and strategic planning to actually complete. So, while Queen Elizabeth was on her deathbed, the Sussex team was busy filing paperwork to monetize the very royal identity that Meghan had spent 2 years publicly tearing down. Insiders at Buckingham Palace later described the internal reaction as one of the most profoundly disrespectful things they had ever seen from the Sussex team during their entire turbulent history. The Queen passed away on September 8, 2022, but the trademark paperwork was submitted weeks before her body was even cold. This commercialization of the family's grief wasn't just planned, it was legally executed while the monarchy's matriarch was still alive. By late 2024, King Charles issued his own private directive, and its meaning was crystal clear. There would be no second Sandringham Summit meeting, no carefully staged public reunion, and absolutely no olive branch extended in their direction. Sophie delivered this final verdict without even a flicker of hesitation. The door wasn't just locked, she explained to them. It had been completely bricked over. Against this backdrop, Harry's continuing legal fight for publicly funded armed security looked even more astonishing and completely out of touch. By early 2024, he was in court trying to buy access to British police protection with his own money, all while holding absolutely no royal duties, performing zero public service and living his life permanently in California. Sophie didn't pull any punches about what that demand truly represented. She explained it was dangerous, setting a precedent that British state protection could be bought by anyone with a royal title, regardless of if they actually served the British public in any meaningful way. She then compared him directly to Prince Andrew, and that comparison was intentionally devastating. Andrew lost his security precisely because his public role had been stripped away. The king was clear there would be no exceptions and absolutely no negotiations. Harry wanted the shield, Sophie explained, without ever wanting to pick up the sword. But just how wrong was he? It turns out the royal family is doing perfectly fine without him and Meghan. So much so their absence feels much more like a blessing than a curse. The crown, of course, endures. Catherine, the institution, and everything that was left behind. As Sophie finally finished speaking, one single image appeared on the screen behind her. It was Catherine, the Princess of Wales, standing right beside King Charles at Sandringham. Crucially, she wasn't performing. She was simply there, looking calm and completely at home in the place she had chosen, and the very role she had built for herself. Sophie had just spent 5 long hours explaining the stark difference between one woman who saw the monarchy as a launchpad for her brand, and another who saw it as her life's true purpose. That powerful image needed no caption. Sophie's constant praise for Catherine during the broadcast wasn't just personal flattery. It was a larger argument about institutional survival made real by contrasting 2 women who entered the same world and made completely opposite choices once they were inside. Catherine, as Sophie explained it, understood from her very first day that serving the crown is a marathon, and that every single year of unglamorous, untelevised service is a long-term investment that pays out over generations, not like some quarterly earnings report. While Meghan burst in demanding to set her own terms with the institution, Catherine spent years quietly learning its unique pace and its many requirements without a single complaint. Sophie then pointed to one specific moment from late 2025 that perfectly captured this entire dynamic in a single telling example. When Catherine announced her together at Christmas concert, a national event focused on celebrating community and quiet, selfless service. Meghan's team in California intentionally moved their Netflix holiday special to broadcast in the very same window of time. Sophie identified it immediately. It was the identical playbook they had been using for years without any variation at all. The Oprah interview was timed to Philip's hospitalization. Their Netflix documentary trailer dropped right during Earthshot. Their holiday special was purposely scheduled against the Christmas Carol service. The strategy never changed, and it was never even subtle. Catherine's concert ended up pulling in 8.4 million viewers. Meghan's own special failed to even crack the top 10 in the United Kingdom. The public had made its judgment clear and delivered a verdict without being asked. By late 2025, the hard numbers across every single category told the complete story with brutal efficiency. Catherine's favourability rating in the United Kingdom stood strong at 73%. William's was at 69%. Meghan's had collapsed to a shocking 17%. Spotify cut its ties with the Sussexes entirely. Netflix had significantly pulled back its massive financial commitment as well. Donations to the Archewell Foundation had plummeted by 40%. The royal glow lifestyle brand Meghan tried to build after Oprah completely failed to find an audience because its premise was based on a contradiction that the public saw through immediately. You simply can't publicly tear down an institution calling it racist and fundamentally cruel, and then try to bottle and sell the very warmth and prestige that same institution is known for. The public saw the hypocrisy, even if Meghan apparently didn't. As Sophie said plainly, you just can't leave a family call it toxic and then try to sell the royal glow as merchandise. The world just isn't that easily fooled. The palace's decision to stay completely silent through Harry's book Spare, through that entire Netflix series, and through every public attack the Sussexes launched for 5 years was a very deliberate and calculated strategy. It was grounded in knowing how this kind of performative conflict actually works. Engaging with someone whose public identity relies on having a powerful enemy is just giving them the exact oxygen they need to keep their fire burning bright. Instead, King Charles and William simply chose to let their work do the talking. State visits, public engagements, and the popular Together at Christmas concert, that patient and consistent record of genuine public service that no production company can fake. It requires years of actual real commitment to build up. As Sophie pointed out, they didn't sue and they never denounced them. They just closed the door and kept on walking. She described the Sussexes now as exiles with style guides. They have their titles, but they have absolutely no role, have no institutional budget, and more critically, zero influence over anything that actually matters within the life and business of the Crown. But Sophie's final point completely reframes this entire era. The Sussex disruption, she argued, hadn't fractured.